Hi, and welcome to another Bible study. Today, we are looking at Genesis 14, and this is about the complexity of rescuing and blessing others through the first part where Abram rescues Lot, and then the second part where Abram is blessed by this guy named Melchizedek. And this is an interesting chapter. In fact, it's probably one of the oddest out of all of the book of Genesis. This is a chapter where it's even difficult. We're not sure who wrote it because the standard, is it part of the J, the Yahwehist? Is it part of the P, the priestly? Is it part of the E, the Elohim? It doesn't really fit anywhere. And so that's kind of an odd thing, which then also makes it difficult to date. However, there's a little bit in there when we get through some interesting notes where it kind of gives away that, all right, it had to have been written after a certain time period. And when we're looking at the text, that the Hebrew words that get translated, first of all, it's even important to notice that the word Hebrew is used for the very first time in the text in Genesis. It's not used very often. It is thought to be connected to the Akkadian term Hebiru, Habiru, which means wanderer, thus describing it's like Abram's clan and descendants. They're wanderers. They keep wandering around the desert. Or it could be based on the word's root, which is minus the suffix of Eber, which can refer to the personal name Eber, an ancestor of the Semitic people from which Abram comes, or it has been translated as one who passed over, as in passed over the river. So Abram, the Hebrew is Abram, the one who passed over the Euphrates, or the Israelites as Hebrews are those who passed over the Red Sea or the Jordan River. We also get in this chapter the name Melchizedek, and Melchizedek means king of justice. And it's said that he reigns in Salem, and the word Salem means the word for peace. And it's interesting because that the king of peace, the king of justice in the city of peace brings Abram bread and water. We also get the term Elion, which is translated as God Most High. And this is who Melchizedek claims is the creator of heaven and earth. Elion is a Canaanite god, more specifically the god of the Jebusites who lived in Salem and the ancient pre-Israelite Jerusalem. It's thought that Salem is the spot of Jerusalem. So thinking about geography-wise, we're talking about in the area close to what is Jerusalem. And then some interesting things to note about the text. Like I said before, it's a very odd text, chapter 14, and it appears more as a war chronicle than a story. And it actually talks about an international war between four kings and a far-off Eastern empire, that they are pitted against five local kings who are vassals for 13 years, and they're now refusing to pay tribute. So a conflict breaks out. And the events of this chapter may very well have been connected to some distant and faded memory. We're left with a mixture of historical and non-verifiable names and places. So that's important why this becomes a difficult chapter to understand who wrote and when was it written. Unlike the rest of the Abram and Abraham narrative, the story opens with international events, whereas everything else is going to start out with his family and what's going on between him and others. The name title, which is there at the beginning, generally understood to reflect the Hittite royal name, Tudhaliya, and there were at least 5 Hittite rulers so named. And the text includes a description of military alliances. The group described in 14:1, especially with Shinar, it refers to Babylon. And you can look at Genesis 10:10 and 11:2. We can look back to that. And it involves kings and empires. The one described in verse 2 of this chapter refers to a small Syro-Palestinian city, all of which are probably located near the Dead Sea. So we're kind of getting a little bit of geography in there. The alliances are of unequal strength. We have 4 kings of major empires versus 5 kings of small city-states. And then the very brief statement about Lot in 14:12 refers to his being taken captive and the plunder of his property. So this is how Abram gets drawn into this. Abram being called Hebrew, like I said, first time, and it only appears 5 other times in the book of Genesis. And usually when it's being used, it's in the mouths of non-Hebrews to describe Hebrews, or is used by Hebrews to describe themselves to foreigners. So it's kind of an interesting descriptive. And all who place their trust in Abram's God are considered Hebrews and grafted onto the vine. So this war that you're reading about, the problem of war, upon hearing the news of Lot's predicament, Abram is transformed into an action hero, a warlord who sets out to save his nephew through military conquest. In this particular chapter, war is glorified, and this is the first place in the biblical text where war is celebrated. And so that begins to bring up some very difficult questions. Abram's initiation of a military campaign seems to have no ulterior motive for gaining from the military conflict. It is simply he is going to go rescue his nephew Lot. But this raises a whole lot of ethical questions and concerns about war in general. The use of violence forever changes a person and a society. And we can see that, like with 1 Chronicles 22:8, King David is told by God that, hey, you don't get to build God's temple in Jerusalem because you've shed too much blood and waged great wars. And so that the recognition of that there are consequences for doing those things. When thinking about Abram and the location of what's getting said in this, Abram pursues the enemy as far as Dan. Okay, well, Dan, the tribe Dan, doesn't exist until after Exodus, because Dan is one of the sons of Jacob, which Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. So to recognize here, okay, what's happening here? So it's possible, it's most likely, right? It's being written after, it's being told after, it's a post-Exodus. It's a great grandson of Abram's that settles, that gets the name Dan. And at this time, the territory during the time of Abram, which that's a rough estimate of when Abram is, it could be anywhere 2500 BCE, 2200 BCE, it could be even 1700 BCE. Like it's not totally clear when that is, but this territory was also called Laish, and that, again, we get that term, we get it in Judges 18:29. So it's just kind of interesting how we're overlapping and what terms are being used. When thinking about Melchizedek, Abram is victorious in battle, and on his return from battle at the valley of Sheba, which is in the vicinity of Jerusalem, this is where he comes across Melchizedek, and Abram accepts his blessings and offers him a tithe. The giving of tithes in this case was not a goodwill offering, but a recognition of one's superiors. And whether Abram's gift to Melchizedek is for maintaining the cult or to help those in need, we're not quite sure exactly why Abraham is doing it, but he is. And so Abram leaves without being in debt to Melchizedek. That's kind of important. Abram has a flashback of citing an oath he had made not to take anything that has come from the king's city. So this may be actually playing off of that, no, they did not have kings and they did not recognize kings until God chooses King Saul, which is right before King David. So just kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind. Abram was a wealthy man, had his own private army, has fulfilled the obligations of kingship, and does not need a reward for it. It's also interesting that Abram seems to put together or confuse the Canaanite god called El Elyon with Yahweh. While Melchizedek worships the Canaanite deity God who created both heaven and earth, in Abram's mind, Melchizedek is really worshiping Yahweh. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Who's the one and only creator of heaven and earth. Eventually, El Elyon will become one of the names for Abram's God. And we see this talked about in the New Testament in the book of Hebrews. We hear it mentioned in the Psalms. So it's kind of interesting where it just kind of pops up. We also may have a connection. Melchizedek may be linked with Zadok, which was a later priest during King David's time. And that comes out in 2 Samuel 8:17, 1 Kings 1:8. And so this may be a complete thing about Melchizedek, and this being an early reference to Salem, so that the text is actually arguing for Jerusalem being a sacred place, and it will serve David's interest. So it's kind of interesting how things may be getting played off here. What does this matter today? We may be thinking, okay, well, Abram rescued Lot, and then he gets blessed, and there's all these things kind of going on. And there's this quote by Martin Luther King Jr. that I think is kind of important for us to think about, especially when there's conflict. When in here, it's talking about war. It's talking about wanting to rescue family. It's also talking about blessing. And so Martin Luther King Jr. made the statement. He said, returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate. Violence multiplies violence. And toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction. So to think about that, of when is action taken and what does it lead to, and the consequences, which can be far greater than just a single moment. And so to really begin to think about that and to use this text to question when is it okay and when is it not, and to question then again also about how do we receive and how do we give blessings? What does that even mean to begin to give and receive blessings to others? I hope you found this helpful. I hope you find the chapter interesting, and I look forward to our next one of Genesis 15. May your day be blessed.